Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar entitled Centering the Voices of the African Diaspora in Europe. My name is Jesper Bjarnesen. I'm a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute. And this is the fourth webinar jointly organized by the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation and the Nordic Africa Institute. I hope you had a chance to just briefly see the introductory slide explaining the format and the overall protocol of this meeting. But just to remind you, this is a webinar organized as a panel conversation. So in the first half of this webinar, I will be engaging in a conversation with our three panelists, whom I'll introduce shortly. After about 40 minutes, we'll then go into a Q&A session where I hope to hear from many of you in the audience to broaden our perspectives and nuance the conversation further. And then after about 40 minutes of Q&A, my colleague from the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, Dr. Adeoye Akinola, will conclude the webinar with a few final reflections. I will introduce the panelists more in a minute, but I thought I would begin by just providing some introductory reflections on our previous webinars and also the broader context of the conversation we're having here today. So as I said, this is the fourth webinar we've organized jointly between the two institutes. The two first webinars focused on the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on African migrants in Europe and on issues of migration governance more broadly. And the most recent webinar was entitled Centering the Voices of African Migrants in Europe. Of African migrants, plainly. During that previous webinar, we heard from Joseph Peters, who left Sierra Leone in 2004 to eventually cross the Mediterranean Sea in 2011 and then settle in Italy, having been granted political asylum. And this story really reminded us of some of the human consequences of irregular migration, but also of the resilience and resourcefulness of people who may have been categorized as irregular, but who have found a way to build a new life in a new place as human beings in all corners of the globe have always done. With some bearing on today's topic, he also pointed out that although he has now made Italy his home, he is still faced with racism and suspicion as a Black man in Italy, and he worries for the future of his children in Italy, although they have formal Italian citizenship. During that webinar, we also heard from Joy Kategekwa, who is the Regional Strategic Advisor to the Assistant Administrator and Director of the Regional Bureau for Africa at the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. She drew on the Scaling Fences UNDP report from 2019 to call for better opportunities, especially for the youth, both on the African continent, but also for a more fair and mutually beneficial regulation of migration between Africa and Europe. Another point that I feel is relevant for our meeting today is that she argued that migration is a family-level livelihood strategy and investment process, as she said, and it enables economic diversification. So she was reiterating the need for shifting the narrative on African migration as an important step in shifting policy thinking around migration governance, which has tended to be focused on security issues and to shift it more towards a development migration nexus kind of thinking. In the previous seminar, we also had a Q&A, and a lot of important points and nuances were raised. For example, that the imbalance of power between the EU and the African Union undermines a joint African position to challenge the European dominance in setting the migration governance agenda. Several participants also emphasized the African Continental Free Trade Area as a key framework for promoting the continental free movement of labor, which would create a more viable livelihood option scenario and also potentially reduce irregular migration. this issue of the asymmetrical relationship between the EU and the African Union has been a recurring theme in our previous webinars. And in one sense, this imbalance is obviously a long-standing one and a very deeply rooted one. On the other hand, and especially in relation to migration governance, the so-called refugee crisis in Europe in 2015 and 16 seems to have deepened some divisions between European and African perspectives, and also polarized views within both continents. I will turn to our panelists shortly. That is the main reason why we're all here, and ask them to reflect on some of these geopolitical continuities and changes. But I also want to mention a few other recurrent themes that point more towards how we might influence policy in this field. So in our previous meetings, we've also come back to the linkages between development and migration. We've talked about the need for shifting the narrative around African migration in different contexts. And we've also come back to talking about the development potential of free movement in particular, which is very much sort of a perspective that has been put forward by African actors in response to the European security agenda, so to speak. Today, we will focus on the perspectives on the African diaspora in Europe. Of course, understanding very well that this is in no way a homogeneous or unified group or category. It's a very diverse set of actors that we sort of can group within the term diaspora. And in a similar way, also, it is important to acknowledge that Europe is not a monolith, that conditions in different European countries affect diaspora opportunities and outlooks, and that perhaps some of these conditions have been changing in recent years. So the African diaspora and the notion of diaspora in general is often celebrated, but in a fairly sort of uncommitting and broad way. So by African leaders, you will often hear that the diaspora are important representatives. They represent connections and investments with their country of origin. But it's not obvious that that sort of positive view on the diaspora is translated into concrete action. On the European side, European leaders more implicitly and more carefully perhaps celebrate the diaspora as the source of the remittances that are sent back to the continent. But at the same time, of course, public opinion in many European countries continues to be marked by racism and Afrophobia. Moving towards introducing our panelists, I just also want to remind you that these webinars that we have co-organized have been spurred by the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation and their initiative to institute a community of practice to contribute to the implementation of the UN-led Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, or the GCM as it is usually called. The GCM already contains a strong diaspora perspective, and I know that Afford, who is represented today by Bora Kamwanya, who I'll introduce more fully in a minute. But Afford has been an integral actor in pushing the diaspora agenda in relation to the Global Compact for Migration, and especially around the goal 19 of the GCM, which is to create conditions for migrants and diasporas to fully contribute to sustainable development in all countries. We're still waiting for one panelist, but I think we should get going with the conversation. So I'd actually like to turn to Bora Kamwanya first. You are the diaspora experience consultant at Afford, working with diaspora volunteers in Europe, but you've also worked extensively with young diaspora entrepreneurs at the European level, as I've understood, and you're involved with the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Young Professionals Network, ACP-YPN, and the Pan-African Youth Union. So you have an extensive experience working with youth-related issues on diaspora questions in different European contexts. So Bora, welcome to the conversation. And the drawing on your experience with diaspora organizations in these different European contexts, how would you describe the political climate around diaspora issues? And would you see the so-called refugee crisis as a significant shift, or are we talking about business as usual, as it were?
Thank you, Jesper, for having us. As you said, my name is Bora Kamanya, and you summarized pretty well my background. Today, as you know, I'm representing Afford, and for those who do not know, Afford is a diaspora-led organization with offices in the UK, in Belgium, so Afford Europe in Belgium, and we have a sister organization in Sierra Leone. Afford has tested and piloted many ideas, and has become a pioneer and innovator in the field of policy and practice on diaspora, migration, and development. We're very glad to be here today. Our mission has always been to enhance and expand the diaspora contribution to development in Africa. And since about 2004, this has been with a particular focus on harnessing diaspora's resources for job creation in Africa. To your question, migration is a long-standing natural human phenomenon. Yet migration is often framed by a certain demographic as a problem to be solved. And perhaps I could point to the fact that Europe's refugee crisis was focusing on a number of people migrating and not necessarily on the root of the issue of migration, if migration is an issue, of course. However, it is undeniable that there was an increase of number of people who were using those specific routes, those specific irregular routes. But we need to see this as a blessing rather than a crisis. In fact, with European aging population, the migrants entering the EU are much more needed today. The recent event in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the demand for the services the manual migrant provide have helped to highlight the essential nature of migration. And key sectors such as distribution, food processing, healthcare, they strongly rely on migrants for their workers. There was a report from the OECD in November 2020 that said that migrants play a disproportionately important role in critical part of the healthcare system. For example, 23% of medical doctors in cities are migrants. And if we look deeper, regarding African refugees, we know the following: about 90% of migrants from Africa, from Africa, takes place in the sub-region. It takes place in Africa. The largest migration takes place from, it's in country, from the rural area to the city, followed by cross borders. So, countries closest to a crisis area are the one hosting most migrants. But overall, economic migrant from the largest percentage of migrant. To just conclude, I would say that there is a lack of recognition of people who are fleeing their country. So a person who's fleeing their country, a country that's not experiencing war or a humanitarian disaster, but just looking for better economic perspective. For example, an Italian going to Belgium is not necessarily compared to a migrant that's leaving Congo to Belgium, for example, looking for a better life experience with the ability to support family members and members of the community. And this is something that we saw in the scaling fences report that you mentioned earlier. The scaling fences report interviewed, I think, about 2,000 migrants who came to Europe from 39 African countries. And in their own word, they mentioned that the motivation to migrate was not necessarily humanitarian or protection related in nature. But one, of course, will still tend to call one person a migrant and the other one an expat. One will be considered as a low-skilled and resource-draining person, whereas the other one will be seen as a valuable addition to the location they're migrating to. Last but not least, I'd like to say that the notion of that migration can be prevented or significantly reduced through programmatic and policy response designed to stop it is actually thrown in question by the scaling Scaling Fences report, the European Union put in place the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa to address the root causes of instability, forced displacement, and irregular migration, and to contribute to better migration management. Africa has the highest number of young people in the world. By 2100, 50% of the world population will be in Africa. And the continent will have to cater for more than 100 million people entering the job market every year. Today, we have to cater for 20 million people entering the job market every year. And these alarming numbers indicate that one major root cause of migration is labor. The lack of decent jobs and aspiration must be what we look at. And according to the fact sheet of the EU Emergency Trust Fund, only 1/5 of the fund is dedicated to greater economic and employment opportunities. You know, and that is one of the issues. We are not really addressing the main problem. And you mentioned earlier in your previous webinar, somebody was expressing the fact that there needs to be more cooperation between the EU and the AU. It is true. You know, that's a challenge. That's another area of challenge. You know, the relationship between the EU and the AU needs to be strengthened, and it needs to be more policy cooperation.
Thank you very much, Bora. Thank you for reminding us of some of the key sort of proportions of migration dynamics. I think this is an important ongoing conversation to sort of challenge the dominant view that still informs especially European policy ideas around migration, that migration is a problem, that it's something to be prevented, etc., and that it's sort of a security threat. So I take that to sort of to mean that there's a lot of work to be done in thinking about more broad-based and proportionate responses and initiatives relating to different forms of migration. I also hear you saying that, and I do agree that there is a tendency to mix different kinds of migrants and you know, whether people have moved voluntarily or involuntarily or for economic reasons or in response to armed conflict. There is a tendency to sort of mix debates in strategic ways, in a way, to make your political point, which is of course a problematic issue that hopefully people such as yourself and this kind of a forum can help challenge. So thank you for those initial reflections. I'll come back to you to hear more about the activities that you have been involved in your own work shortly. But I'd like to introduce our second panelist, Dr. Tekalin Ayalev Mingiste, joining us from Addis Ababa. It's very good to see you, Tekalin. Welcome to the webinar. You are the chair of social anthropology at Addis Ababa University and an affiliated researcher at the Department of Social Anthropology at Stockholm University. And you've been working extensively on refugee mobility, diaspora issues, of course, on transnationalism, human smuggling, with a geographical focus mainly on the Horn of Africa, but also on the Sudan, looking at conditions in Italy and Sweden, the UK, among other issues. So another panelist here with a broad experience that we are looking forward to learning more about. So I opened the seminar by trying to draw sort of some broad strokes in terms of understanding the political context for the African diaspora in Europe. So Tekalin, based on your research and your experiences, would you say that the so-called refugee crisis of 2015 and 16, has it changed conditions for the African diaspora in Europe dramatically, or is it more of the same? And in which ways do you see this question playing out?
Thank you, Jesper, having me. As you said, I would reflect my responses to your question based on my research and also recent developments, as well as my experience in particular among the particular diaspora communities. So these are the Eritrean and Ethiopian diaspora in Sweden, in Italy, and particularly in UK. So I work closely, as you said, with this group. So my responses may not reflect the entire African diaspora in Europe, even though it can reflect or tell us some dimension of it. Of course, there are shared common experience as well as unique kind of national diaspora experience, as you mentioned earlier. So to come to your question, I think it affected in several ways. The perspectives, the so-called refugee crisis in Europe in 2015 and 2016 has affected the diaspora life in several ways, but maybe we can, I can focus on two issues particularly. One is, of course, from my observation and also from different reports, we can see that particularly in Sweden, from the crisis, from the refugee crisis and the increasing migration debates in Sweden and more generally in Europe, one impact is, of course, the increase of xenophobia and the xenophobic attacks, as you might have seen in Sweden. The second impact is, of course, I will come to this point in detail. The second impact we can say is on the increase of economic burden on refugees, particularly on diaspora in Europe, particularly in Sweden. So why is that? I will come to that point. So to start with the increase of economic burden, what does it mean? Of course, after the refugee crisis and the increase of the arrival of large number of Eritreans and Ethiopians to Sweden particularly, what happened was, as you remember, the migration control was becoming very restrictive. And as you know, large number of migrants, particularly from East Africa, they are making long journeys to Europe. So when the migration controls increased, the mobility becoming costly and longer. So as you know, most of the migration costs are covered by the diaspora themselves. So when it becomes more costly, more challenging, the diaspora has to cover all these costs. So as you know, diaspora often sponsor and cover the cost of refugee journeys and migration. And as migration is becoming, as I said, very expensive, they have to pay to more smugglers, more criminals, more kidnappers. So it is huge burden, particularly for Eritrean diaspora in Sweden, because they have to pay all these actors because the control was becoming more strict, more tough. So that a lot of family members are coming. As you know, Eritrean refugee migration is so huge. So this is very big challenge for particularly Eritrean diaspora, Ethiopian diaspora. So many Eritrean diasporas, they told me that they are indebted. They borrow money from banks, diaspora-based saving and credit associations. So debts are serious problem because they have family duty. They have to pay. They have to cover the costs. This was main challenge. Migration is also the other challenge. Was, of course, it affected the refugee crisis and the consequent conditions. After the 2015 crisis, migration routes, mobilities never stopped, but it rerouted or redirected to south and the southeast migration increased. And this has created, increased Ethiopian and Eritrean diaspora more within Africa, within East Africa particularly. So already we have a huge diaspora, Eritrean and Ethiopian diaspora in the region, in the IGAD region in East Africa. So because of the EU migration routes are becoming more difficult, so Eritreans and Ethiopians began to move more and more to the southeast, to Gulf states, to south to South Africa. So already the existing diaspora increased, and this has created a new kind of diaspora relations within Africa, within East Africa. So there's a new kind of dynamics is emerging. So it could be positive or negative, we don't know. But main impact was the rerouting and the redirection migration patterns from towards EU to instead to South and Southeast migration. So that was main impact. Reports of refugee deaths and the migration crisis in Libya and the Mediterranean field, anti-homeland government protests from diaspora towards Eritrean and Ethiopian regimes. This is also another impact because there was a lot of crisis happened, and usually, as later I can mention, so this has becoming a media issue, a great issue, so that Eritreans are dying as a Mediterranean. In Libya, they are kidnapped, they are sold as slaves, and all these things were disseminated among diaspora. So this has, created anger among Eritrean and Ethiopian diaspora in many European countries, including in Sweden, and they began more and more putting pressure on the homeland government, both in Eritrea and Ethiopia as well, actually. So because many of this crisis in the starting from 2013, this shipwreck and this accident happened in the Mediterranean Sea. This has, created a big, kind of reaction from diaspora, so that the homeland governments are not stopping this irregular migration. They are blaming the homeland government. So there was this anti-government protests and already existing diaspora political engagement took a different direction, and in more tense way actually towards to the homeland states, toward either both Ethiopia and Eritrea as well. So this is one area maybe could be more explored from my experience and from my research. I observed this. This is the main thing. Another thing is, so within the diaspora, what I've observed is also it has created, more internal divisions within diaspora. Some are against homeland government, is blaming everything to the homeland states. Others are saying no, it's a blame of it's a problem of Europe. So this kind of already, as you said, it's not homogeneous in one diaspora. We have different kinds of diaspora, ethnic-based diaspora. So it's not homogeneous in the one and the same. So when we say Ethiopian diaspora, they are not one group. There are several types, several categories there. So there are political affiliationists, opposition groups, different actors there. It more increases the drift and the division within diaspora. So this is the main problem, actually. Another main challenge is, of course, the refugee crisis and the mass arrival of refugees to Sweden, also said to have increased the so-called xenophobia, actually. This is actually could be more explored, but what I've been observing and what it has been said, particularly in Sweden, was that the xenophobic attacks targeting Blacks and the Muslim immigrants, particularly the so-called Islamophobia and the Black phobia, you can say Afrophobia, but there are different names for that. So they say this is increasing after the refugee crisis. As you know, Sweden received in 2015 160,000 asylum seekers, next to Germany, actually. In terms of per capita population, Sweden was the largest refugee receiving country at that time. So Sweden used to be like appreciated, the most generous, having the most generous welfare state, open asylum systems, and it has been appreciated, as you know. But the refugee crisis happened. Then, as you know, all these extremist parties, far-right populist parties were emerging in Europe as well as in Sweden. This is coincided with also violent youth attacks, as you know, in Usby, in all migrant concentrated ghettos in Sweden. So there was a lot of debates and talks about how to handle these refugees. And on the other hand, the refugees are no more, the immigrants are no more. There's this debate that they are left behind from the achieving and all this labor market performance, and the youth, particularly teenagers, are becoming violent. Sweden used to be peaceful, but now because of the large number of refugee arrivals and the failure of the welfare system, all this public debate was increasing in Sweden. And this has created a lot of things actually. So this could be actually further explored. But but the main thing was that this xenophobic attacks, which was not common in Sweden, was increasing because of these things.
Right. Excellent. Thank you very much, Tekelin. We'll come back to you to hear more about your views on the Somali and Ethiopian diaspora experiences in a minute. But I think your last reflections here on the political climate in Sweden especially is a very convenient link to our our third panelist. So I think I will thank you for now, Tekelin, and then introduce our third panelist, Kitimbwa Sabuni. You're a Swedish organizational developer and public debater, and you're a well-known spokesperson for the National Association of Afro Swedes and the Muslim Human Rights Committee in Sweden. And of course, you've been an important voice in the public conversation around Afrophobia and everyday racism in Sweden for quite some time now. So Kitimbwa, welcome to the conversation. And from your perspective, how would you characterize the political climate around, let's call them diaspora issues in the Swedish context? And do you have any thoughts on how the refugee crisis has influenced that environment?
Thank you very much, Jesper, for the generous introduction. And I am very happy to join this conversation. To begin with, maybe I should say a little something about the National Association of Afro Swedes. So it's an organization that have been around for more than 30 years now. And I think in that way, we have been able to also develop with the trajectory of the presence of African diasporic people in Sweden. So when the organization started, there weren't that many Afro-Swedish people around, I would say. And now the African presence, or the African diasporic presence, has ballooned, not in the sense that we are that many. I think we're around 2% of the population, but still we have gone from a more or less non-presence to an actual presence, which has also helped form an identity around the Afro-Swedishness, I would say. And having said that, what have been happening for the last 30 years? I think we witnessed a major transformation, and I think it also has to do with refugees issues, since Sweden, I should tell you, is a country that doesn't really want to recognize that there is a specific identity or a specific experience that people might have as a result of having African origins or being Black people. Black people are always understood as refugees, in terms of refugees, and that's the kind of conversation we're having. And having said that, it's fascinating to see how limited the debate on immigration is in Sweden. I think that the parameters of the discussions is that, to speak metaphorically, that there are some people who don't have their house in order, and now they want to come to our house, Sweden. And since we are generous, some of them can come, but there is a limit to our generosity, right? And then there's a debate about that limit. So how many people should be allowed to come and how many shouldn't be allowed to come. But then there's also another discussion, and it's a discussion about what can reasonably be asked from these people who are coming to Sweden, right? In that discussion, it's obvious who the we are. What can we ask? Because the we is never African, people of African origin, whether or not they're born in Sweden or they've been here for decades. The we is always white people. And that's something that becomes painfully obvious. So for that reason, the discussion about immigrants and migration and integration isn't just about people who are actually migrating. It's very much about African diasporic people and other people, that hail from the global South within Sweden. It's very much about us. And what we have seen after the so-called refugee crisis, but it's been a development that's been going on since the 90s, I would say, is that the discourse have changed a lot. The political discourse have changed. So I would say that the politeness and the manners that was around before has totally switched, and now you have a brutalized discourse where within the political mainstream, things are being said about immigrants as being everything from rapists, so-called refugees, to burdens of any kind, or infiltrating Islamist terrorists coming here to harm people, and all of those things can be said. And I think that that kind of conversation just goes to show the need that there is to center African voices within the discussion about immigration, because we haven't really been allowed to be part of that conversation, because it's fascinating actually, because most of us, of course, have some kind of background of immigration, or parents who have migrated, or contact with African continent. So we should be part of that conversation for that reason. But because we're not considered part of the so-called we're not allowed within that conversation. And I would add that the idea of being Swedish is very much linked to race. So we can be citizens on paper, but still we're not really entitled, we're not really deserving of whatever this state has to offer. And it makes us some kind of second-rate citizen. And I think that's detrimental to Swedish democracy. That becomes a kind of herrenfolk democracy, to use a German term, where there are a specific group of people who are the real people, almost like in fascism. And then you have another group of people who are the non-citizens, or even the uncitizen, the problem. And that becomes us, and being Black people, we're very visible in that sense. So I just think that it's important, that this debate about migration doesn't just stay where it is today as a technical discussion, or a practical discussion, like how many people can come, how do we deal with them, because there also needs to be a moral debate around this. And it's not like there's no moral understanding, because I think that the way that this is debated in Sweden is based on a moral superiority that is taken for granted from the European perspective, right? And it's built on the idea that migration policies are basically fair, right? Or even generous. And also the other thing is that Europe and Sweden have nothing, they're only reacting to global migration forces. They have nothing to do, they haven't been part of shaping these things. So even if Sweden sends their troops to Libya to destabilize that countries with horrible effects, even if Sweden takes part in wars in Afghanistan and all that stuff, and not to mention the global economical system where resources and capital keep on flowing this way, that has nothing to do with people coming here. So I think that is something that actually needs to be spoken about. It's not just like some philosophical discussion that has no meaning. It's really, really relevant. And I think that we are actually the ones that can bring that to the fore, because as a previous speaker was saying, Bora said that, I mean, migration isn't something that can actually be stopped, but you can construct the idea of irregular, rather illegal immigrants. It's an idea. It doesn't mean that these people will stop coming, but it gives them a different status as criminals, as uncitizens, as problems. Whereas when Europeans used to migrate all over the world in a colonial context, often it just happened to coincide with other nations' need for people, and then it became okay. But I don't think that it would have stopped people from migrating from Sweden during the famines of the late 19th century or what have you, just because someone said, no, it's illegal. So, seriously, we should have these kinds of discussions, I think.
Thank you very much for those reflections. I think it's so important to bring race back into the conversation around migration governance, because I completely agree that there is this tendency to make it a technical discussion rather than a moral and political discussion. A lot of really valuable points there, so thank you for that. I will turn back to Bora now, because we've heard fairly, I think, nuanced and critical reflection on the political context of the African diaspora in Europe from different perspectives. Let's turn more now towards sort of what is actually going on within different diaspora groups. So Bora, based on your engagements and experiences, could you tell us more about what you've seen in terms of the most important connections, relations, activities between the African diaspora and actors on the continent? What would you emphasize as some important means of connection and exchange in that sense?
Thank you. I think, you know, one of the most important aspect to note about the diaspora is a good partner for job creation, decent job creation on the continent. Since earlier I was talking about the fact that one of the root causes of migration, especially for economic migrant, is the lack of decent jobs. I think we can do a lot more with resources for decent job creations, but there's a lack of resources for the diaspora to be more impactful. It's already amazing the marvels that the diaspora is doing with the limited resources that they have. There's a lot of opportunities that we're not tapping into, and by not seeing how we can leverage the diaspora remittance, we are losing big time, because remitters, they are resilient, and we need to leverage their contribution. I'm going to give a couple of examples. Afford, for example, the Afford family recognized 6 forms of diaspora capital that we can tap into. We have finance, of course, which is remittance and investment. And I would just note that in 2019, diaspora remittance in Africa globally was $87 billion, which is considerable. We also recognize the intellectual capital, which will be skills and knowledge transfer. We have the social capital, which would refer to, you know, how the diaspora leverage their social network for development. Culture, which is, you know, promoting promotion of ethnic goods, foods, clothing, art, etc. Political, which is perhaps a major one. It includes lobbying, advocacy, and perhaps I could also highlight what you said earlier, Jesper, that Afford contributed to Objective 19 of the Global Compact on Migration. You know, and this is part of the political capital the diaspora can have. And also the country of Senegal is offering 15 parliamentary seats to its diaspora since 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And also Afford also participated into the development of SDG 10C on remittance costs. Last but not least, time in terms of volunteering. That the diaspora has been volunteering a lot on the continent. And on our own experience, we've created more than 1,000 decent jobs in 9 African countries. And all this thanks to the diaspora contribution. We've put in £1 million in investment in 4 countries, and there's been a match fund of £500,000 from the diaspora. And on the volunteering side, we have a project called Supporting Entrepreneurs and Enterprise Development in Africa, and we have more than 150 diaspora volunteers supporting 800 businesses in Africa. So it's very important to tap into the resources that the diaspora are bringing. You know, right now we're working on a project in Benin. You know, and the aim of this project is to mobilize diaspora investors and volunteers across Europe in order to create jobs. You know, also to provide capacity building and business, you know, and business development to Beninese and diaspora. We also increase the means of livelihood and business skills of Beninese youth and women. And overall, we're trying to strengthen the African business network. But I think the most important is to also note the contribution of young people. Young people and second, third, and, you know, following diaspora generations. We have an emotional connection to the continent, and we are more interested in, you know, investment and win-win business. In my own experience, you mentioned that I work with the Pan-African Union and ACP-YPN. You know, we've seen, you know, by bridging the diaspora and the young people on the continent, we've seen a lot of investments in farming cooperative, Afro fusion restaurants. You know, you really mixing this European and African cuisine. Well, African, it's very broad, but you know, local African cuisine, hospitality business, fintech. So there is a lot of investment the diaspora is bringing. But of course, the issue is that the policies that our leaders are putting forward do not follow the real need to tackle what is called the migration crisis. You know, for example, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Young Professional Network, we have a lobby group where we try to include young people from the ACP countries in order to have fair and inclusive trade agreements between the EU and the Organization of ACP countries. We organize youth conferences to make sure they understand exactly what's going on, and also they can, you know, lobby locally. We also have ADIFE, the African Diaspora Youth Forum Europe. And that one is connecting young people from the diaspora and young people on the continent into innovating and creating what they're calling the new California of Africa, especially, you know, if you're looking at Kenya today. And all this organization, diaspora organization, they are participating into what's happening with the Pan-African Union to make sure that national youth councils on the continent are aware of what the diaspora is doing, and that we can bridge and try to find solutions and coordinated effort to better development of Africa. Last but not least, I would say that, you know, young people are also significant consumer and promoters of African goods, you know, such as new music, fashion, art, culture, and food. And they are the one introducing these goods and this know-how, this expertise on the European market. And that's also something you find in the baggages of migrants when they come. They also bring this. They also bring this this multiculturality, if I can say. It is thanks to migrants that Europe can call itself a multicultural continent. I would like to extend more, but I'll listen to our colleagues, and then perhaps have some more time. I'll touch upon other findings we had with Afford. We launched a mapping report. We wanted to map out the Beninese diaspora, and we came to realize that 98% of the Beninese diaspora was in the sub-region, not even in Europe, and that was something that, you know, would challenge the view of some people drafting policies here in Europe.
That's excellent, Bora. Thank you very much for that, and thank you also for emphasizing sort of these different dimensions of the work that is already being done. It seems to me that the main lacks in terms of policy are at the multilateral level. It's sort of there's a lot missing in the European conversation about the strength, for example, about the strength of the African diaspora and the contribution already being made. And I think that your examples illustrate that very strongly. And also this sense that, you know, that the African cultural influence and knowledge and sort of capabilities should not be something set aside, but rather something emphasized and sort of acknowledged and celebrated. So I really appreciate that contribution. Tekelin, can I turn to you? I know that you're primarily engaging with diaspora issues as a researcher, similar to myself. So from your perspective, what would you see as some of the sort of most important fields of interaction and connection between diaspora groups in Europe and actors on the continent?
Thank you, Jesper. Yeah, as again, my experience also from this East African countries, diaspora, Somalis, Eritreans, and Ethiopians that I have worked with. Of course, the contribution is, their connections to the homeland is very significant, as earlier speaker was mentioning. In several ways, of course, they are engaged in individual, family, community, and the national level, actually. They have individual projects, buying resources, houses, income-generating activities toward this community supporters, development association supporters to the national level, that's the usual classical diaspora engagement area. So there's multiple dimensions they are engaging. Of course, if you take the Ethiopian example, our remittance reached, the total annual remittance reached $5 billion annually from all over the world, of course. Main ones are, of course, Gulf states, Europe, and the US. But of course, COVID-19 disrupted many things. The remittance, the connections, the diaspora engagements are severely affected as COVID-19 disrupted overall migration patterns, mobilities, and remittance flows, as you know. So there are a lot of reports how COVID crisis impacted this. But of course, knowledge and technology transfer in East Africa, particularly in Ethiopia, it's very, very significant. Particularly, as you know, they are participating as groups, interest groups. For example, Ethiopian Medical Professional Associations in the US, and Ethiopian Medical Association in Sweden, Ethiopian Medical Associations in Europe. They have these associations and organized groups, interest groups supporting hometowns, and also and supporting ministries, important specific ministries in Ethiopia, particularly because Ethiopia is in a country in a major reform and a transition. So they are supporting the Ministry of Science and Higher Education. Professors have association in Europe, and they are also coming to teach in the universities to do collaborative research, collaborative publications, and also the Ministry of Science and Higher Education highly supported. Ministry of Health is highly supported by Ethiopian diaspora in Europe. So IT experts, particularly because the country is digitalizing everything in Ethiopia, particularly. There are these kind of supporters. And the main important thing that's significant, that's visible, that Ethiopian diaspora in Europe and also in the US are supporting is engaging is technical, financial, and political support of the Ethiopian Great Renaissance Dam. As you know, this dam has very controversial and a lot of issues are there. So Ethiopian diaspora financially supporting, lobbying for these controversies between Ethiopia has with downstream countries, with Sudan and also Egypt, as you know. It's a media issue, the AU issue, it's a big regional issue, actually, the dam issue. So the diaspora is also taking part in lobbying and negotiating, also, of course, contributing financially. When it comes to political engagement, be it Ethiopian and Eritrean diaspora in Europe or in other places, the political engagement is, we can see it in two dimensions. Of course, the diaspora used to be peacemakers, of course, as research shows. They have been supporting reforms, democratization. At the same time, there's also another dimension of it, also some claim, and of course, there is this kind of tendency that they are also somehow, some groups are also conflict triggers. So we have to see that. So we are not romanticizing all diaspora engagement. So we have to be very careful and critical. So as we say, diaspora is not homogeneous, of course, and of course there are different interest groups. For example, in East Africa, as you know, the conflict is, armed insurgents groups, secessionist movements, all these groups are, armed resistance groups are financially, technically, and materially supported by the diaspora. So they are, of course, peacemakers, lobbying, transition to democracy, all these things, particularly in Ethiopia, they are helping. At the same time, our diaspora is also divided. So as homeland politics is reflected in the diaspora. So the homeland politics affects diaspora, diaspora affects homeland politics. So this is not linear or predictable. It's very complicated trajectories and waves we have to reflect on. So I can't go to the details, but these are also another issue. And also, of course, issue of trust is very important. Of course, diaspora is expecting something from homeland states. Also, homeland states also expecting this the so-called remittance transfer, technology, knowledge transfer. This has been repeatedly said, and the World Bank and all international committees are, supporting this. These are very important, of course, but the diaspora is also demanding. In terms of protecting migrants. This is the concern among Ethiopian, the Eritrean diaspora in Europe. So that, okay, you are expecting that diaspora should contribute, but you have to also protect Ethiopian citizens, Eritrean citizens who are dying in migration routes in Gulf states, in South Africa, and Europe. So to what extent Ethiopia, the homeland states, reaching out diaspora, not to tap, but also to collaboratively help each other. This was main issue, of course, and this is also, as a political dimension, is also issue of trust and mistrust, and creating peace and conflict. So it's a very mixed picture. We have to see it. So I can go later.
Thank you, Tekelin, and thank you for restating that sort of that complexity that you know, it doesn't do anyone any favors to either romanticize or to just as it does not do any favors to sort of target diaspora groups in a negative way. Obviously, we shouldn't fall in the opposite extreme and just romanticize the role of the diaspora. So thank you for that reflection, and also for the sort of the examples of how diaspora groups and individuals are involved in both social, economic, and political interactions with actors on the continent. Kitimbwa, before I open up for the Q&A, I'd like to turn to you also. Could you share some reflections? How do you see the relationship between diaspora groups and actors on the continent? I know that your work is not necessarily as practical as, for example, Bora's, but from your perspective, what would your thoughts be on the relationship between actors on the continent and the diaspora in Europe? Sorry, can you
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, as you said, yes, but that is not our field as an organization. We're kind of focused on Sweden and what happens here. That is not to say that we are uninterested in Africa. It's just that as we have seen it, it's that Europe and the United States are still the colonial metropole, so to speak. And it means that important decisions that regards Africa will be made here. And we've seen other diasporic groups that want to wield influence. They do that by becoming influential in the West. And you can take as a case in point, you have the partition of the Sudan. I don't think that would have happened without the influence of Sudanese diasporic groups in the United States that were pushing for it. So a lot of decisions are made here. So, but having said that, when it comes to how we relate I'll talk about how we relate to the continent through the Swedish state, right? And there's this thing taking form that I would call a certain kind of identity of Afro-Swedishness, of a collective Africanness that is Pan-African and Swedish. Away from national identities, because they are of less socio-political significance. So at least for people who have grown up here, who are born here and so on, even though, you know, they can have kind of attachment, right, to ethnic groups or nation states, you know, through their parents and all that things, we see that the socio-political relevant category is blackness here, right? And however, when it comes to how we relate to the Swedish state and trying to influence outcomes on the continent, I see that we're still doing that through a national lens, like we do that as actors having roots in certain specific African countries. And I think that sometimes that means that we lend ourselves to particular states' agendas. So as an example, the Horn of Africa, I think, is the place where most Afro-Swedish people originate from, right? And I think we can see a development where people of Somali origin or Ethiopian origin or Eritrean origin, they try to lobby the state from a point of view of their specific origin. And sometimes those interests, they don't coincide. And I think we should ask ourselves as Africans, is this the way forward or isn't it? And at the same time, unfortunately, I think that sometimes the what we can call the younger generation, who have that more Pan-African identity, they don't have any channels or venues through which to try to influence outcomes through the Swedish state as Swedish citizens active in this democracy. I think that's really regrettable, and I sometimes wonder what can be done about that, and how maybe we can look into that together with the Nordic African Institute. See what you have to say about that. Oh.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very worthwhile avenue to explore much more in many ways. And I see in some of our outreach that we do see young people with some connection to the continent, eager to learn more and to engage more. But as you say, that there may not be as many contact points for people who do not have a direct family connection, for example, to engage with. And of course, the Pan-African perspective is very much in line with the work of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation. So there's definitely a broader conversation to be had there as well. Thank you, all three of you, for these really useful reflections. And I think we've sort of sketched out now a very nuanced picture of the many different questions and issues and dynamics that make out our sort of the question of African diaspora voices, obviously. And of course, we can't expect to come to any grand conclusions, but I'd like to invite the audience in now to provide your perspectives and also your questions to the panelists. So you can either raise your hand, which means that I will see your name at the top of my list and call upon you to ask your question, or you can write your questions or reflections in the Q&A, and I'll try to sort of keep an eye on both channels here. And I'll collect sort of a couple of questions or reflections and then give the panelists a chance to respond as they wish. So I see here on the, let's see. So the first hand risen here is Kabonina Masango. Let's see. So I would like you to ask a question. Oops, unmute. Camila, I'm not sure I'm doing this right, but I would love to hear from Kabonina Masongo. Kabonina, can you hear me? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Good afternoon. How are you?
Well, thanks. Welcome to the session. What is your reflection?
I think this was a very informative webinar, and I actually touched on a lot of key points. However, I wanted to ask a question regarding just COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. So for COVID-19 pandemic, as the panelists highlighted that the COVID-19 pandemic did disrupt migration. However, because now I've seen across Western Africa, particularly, there is an issue with PPEs and access to vaccines. Can't this now also be another concern, whereas now people and now citizens of those states now will start migrating because of the lack of COVID-19 response material and responses from their country states. And then for my last question with regards to climate change, because like because of the global North states who have created a lot of emissions and are the biggest instigators of accelerating climate change. Now Africa is becoming more and more unlivable because of the harsh weather conditions. Is Europe now being more receptive, or are they creating better policies now? Because a lot of countries globally are struggling with a lot of states are sinking, some are being washed away by floods, there's massive droughts. So now what is Europe going to do about that with regards to the migration policies, particularly with African states? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I forgot to ask you, Kabonina, could you state are you affiliated to an organization or a university? Or?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yes, my name is Kabonina Masango, and I'm a newly appointed research coordinator for the Institute of Pan-Africanism and thoughts and conversation.
All right. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Okay.
All right. So we also have a raised hand from, and this speaker I know, this is Stella Opoku Owusu from Afford. She was announced in the program as one of the panelists, and I forgot to mention that shift in the beginning. But Stella, I'm very glad that you are here. Please, would you share your reflections as well?
Yes, absolutely. Can I just check you can hear me okay?
You're coming through very well.
All right, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. It was just really interesting just listening to everyone speak. And of course, yes, I am Stella. I'm the Deputy Director at Afford. I just wanted to share a few reflections, really, I think, from some of the comments that had been made by the speakers, in particular from Kitimbua and Tikalin. I think the first point, really, which is really important, and I think Kitimbua was talking about this, was the issue of race. I think since the Black Lives Matter, the movement last year after the murder of George Floyd, I think, of course, it resonated, as we saw, across the world. But I think one of the important things that really came out of this, at least in the sector that we work in on migration, was the importance, really, of starting to talk about race within the context of migration. Something that strategically and at an international level, in a sense, it's not really done. It's kind of there, but it's not really spoken about or discussed in the same way that we have other thematic areas, other intersectionalities on gender, etc. There isn't that same discussion on race. And some of that, again, I think Kitimbua was making a lot of reference in Sweden to the this sort of citizen versus the non-citizen, and and all the isms, if you like, around that. And I had a conversation a few weeks ago just about trying to understand a bit more as to why the issue of race is not really spoken about in migration governance. And one of it is about economics. And of course, if you talk about citizenship, there is a matter of economics there. And so some of what, of course, it comes down to, unfortunately, is around economics, and which also means that there isn't, in as much as in the last year, we've had a lot of states in the West talk about migrant workers, or the areas in which a lot of migrant workers are in, as being essential services. There still isn't a recognition of that contribution that diaspora and migrant communities are actually making in their countries of residence. And therefore, if you were to look at that, even within the framework of economics, you would be able to make that sort of argument. And I think that's important because in as much as, during the so-called refugee crisis, we also saw an increase in the West on the right side, if you like. So in terms of, the sentiment and the politics of the right was increasing, and that still continues, right? So it's not really surprising that we have these issues of race as we see them at the moment. But I think also just linking that in with the point that Tekelin had made about the issue of trust and mistrust as well. And absolutely agree with that, and as much as we know and we understand and we want to support the diaspora to contribute, there should also be an understanding that to be able to support the diaspora to contribute effectively, you've also got to provide the support. And that could come in different ways, and that could be in different times and moments, as dire as some of the circumstances that Tekelin was sharing, with us. But I think, it's going pretty much just back to the fact that in terms of, regardless of the situations in countries of residence, you will still find that the diaspora continue to contribute, that those who can continue to contribute. And I think I just wanted to share just a stat there. In, I think last year, when the World Bank had indicated that the projection of a decrease in remittances was going to be something like 20%. in sub-Saharan Africa and globally. And then, of course, by the end of the year, they had come back to say that they were looking more around 14%. Now, if you look at a number of African countries, they've actually exceeded remittances from the previous year. So I think there is a resilience in remittances, and there's a resilience in diaspora, and that is really powerful. And that is something that, you know, we need to be able to tap into. I'll leave it there, but it would be great perhaps if Teklin and Kitimbua had any further reflections on the issue of race and migration, and any solutions, I suppose, perhaps in the Sweden sort of context that they might have thought about to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stella, for those reflections. I think what I'll do is I'll read one comment from the Q&A box, and then I'll hand over to the panelists before I take another round of questions. So we have a reflection from Steve Mugerwa as well. He writes, lack of a recent colonial background used to be a great Swedish asset on issues of dealing with the third world. Could it be that this has been eroded? Compare Ugandan Asian migrants' children in the UK have become ministers. We don't necessarily need to focus just strictly on the Swedish context, but there is a question about sort of some of the specific historical connections between European countries and the continent that perhaps we should reflect more about. So I think what I'll do is I'll just give the panelists a chance to comment on the reflections we've heard from the audience so far. So we first had some reflections on the effects of the COVID pandemic. Stella addressed it to some extent, but if you have any thoughts on how the pandemic has affected diaspora dynamics, that would be one thing. Then there was the reflection about climate change impacts on the African continent and the meaning in terms of how it will affect the migration flows and dynamics. And then, of course, as you've just heard, Stella raised some more reflections on why race has not been spoken about so explicitly around migration governance. So I'll ask Bora first. Do you have any reflections on these contributions? Anything you'd want to add?
Perhaps I'll just note that one of the biggest European country, France, is going to presidential elections next year. So it seems like this topic will arise again, especially the topic of the role of migrants, the topic of migration, and also race will dominate the media. And at this moment, we are 1 year before the elections, but in France, they're already speaking of Marine Le Pen, who is the president of Rassemblement National, the extreme right party, that she might actually win the election this time. And Stella mentioned the issue with the topic of Black Lives Matter last year. In most European countries, we see that it is the police that actually backs the far right parties, and it will be very interesting to see if France will go into this civil war that some French political analysts are predicting, because one party, so the center and the left, are for migration, whereas the far right is against migration. So I'm just looking forward to having this discussion again in a year after those elections.
We should certainly follow. Thank you, Bora. We should certainly follow up on that and other political developments. And it's true that this catch-all idea of migration continues to be sort of political fuel in many European contexts, which is, of course, important to deal with and reflect on in different ways. Tekelin, do you have any reflections either? You mentioned already some of the effects of the pandemic. Do you have anything to add there, or on the issues of race and trust that the comments spoke about?
Thank you, Jesper. I think the important question is, and comments were raised by the first question, and also by Stella. Of course, yeah, COVID-19 disrupted migration movements and diaspora engagements in several ways in East Africa. Of course, if you take the example from Ethiopia, it disrupted migration movements in 3 ways. First, of course, it affected because Ethiopia is sending country for labor deployment to the Gulf states. Because of the restrictions of mobility, the aspiring and the would-be migrants forcefully stay still in their origin country, and also there's mass deportation from the Gulf states and many other places. This was another crisis, and also some of them are more stuck on the migration routes because borders are closed, and these are one impact. And others, of course, significant decrease in remittance, of course, in Ethiopia and in many East African countries. So COVID, of course, has significant impact. We will see, of course, there's resilience, still remittances coming, flowing back, but there's several ways. Reports are also coming out. We can see a lot of research reports available by different UN organizations have been producing, particularly IOM and the UNHCR reports can show us in detail. We can see that. Of course, climate change, yes. Climate change and migration relations, it is very, very important. In East Africa, particularly, migration movements are also related to not only conflicts, but also climate disasters, flooding, all kinds of natural disasters related to climate change, internal displacement, and then rural to urban migration, stepwise migrations into the region, and also to abroad. So in several ways, migration and climate change are related, but of course it's a research area to explore more how it is changing, onset climate change, how mobilities and immobilities and how the social protection policies are affecting climate change management and also migration governance, how they are intersecting. These things are very, very important, and I think it's a coming research area in migration studies generally, and it's true, it's impacting. To come to the Stella's comments, I think it's true, this issue of race, as an earlier speaker was mentioning, it's in several ways it's there. Long time ago, it's revived and came back in a very new fashion with the global incidents such as the migration crisis in 2015, as well as the so-called migration crisis, and also, of course, the George Floyd issue, and of course, the emergence of far-right populist parties in Europe, and all these things. The election issue, it became an election issue, migration, as you know. The politics is very much shaped in Europe is by migration discourses, in the US as well. So this would continue, I guess. So, and how this in migration governance reflected very much, I'm not sure how. There are some research institutes emerging in Uppsala. Jesper, you know, there's a center for racial study. My supervisor was there. If you remember, Sharam was working on there. So I said it's still coming back, and it's a very important issue. But I think the most important thing we African states should think about is the issue of building trust with the diaspora. I think that's very important, because the diaspora not just contribute, but also they need service. They go to the embassies. What kind of embassies African states have in Europe or elsewhere, where the diasporas come for protection, for services, for visa, for dual citizenship, for national IDs, all these things. Where the diaspora associations, diaspora needs also service protection, not only just contributing. So there's this kind of mutual support, mutual understanding is very, very important. So through that we can tap more. So it's a two-way expectations are there. So trust is very, very important. So that's what I can say. Of course, these post-colonial approaches to migration studies, there's controversies there because of this chat that you are reading, Jesper. I think it depends on the situation. So I personally don't buy the post-colonial perspectives of understanding migration. It has impacts, of course. It's coming back in different dimensions, but we have different other ways of analyzing it instead of because it's very much dependent on current political dynamics, and the global dynamics are very much shaping the migration governance and discourse rather than the colonial, post-colonial things. So that's my view, but there are
Thank you.
different
Yeah.
dimensions.
Thank you, Tekelin. No, it's a very good point. Thank you for pointing out some of those nuances. We can't blame it all on colonialism, of course. Kitimbwa, so the issue of race now has resonated with several of the comments we've had. Stella was asking for solutions. That might be a tall order, but how do you see? How would you see sort of what are the possibilities for challenging xenophobia and racism on the basis of diaspora mobilization? Is that something you've thought about? Or what would be your take on the racial question in that sense?
I'll try to be brief, but I want to stress that I think actually that the post-colonial analysis is very useful, and I think that it has been underused in Sweden. Let's just do a little bit of history. You know, there was this Swedish intellectual that wrote a book in the 50s called An American Dilemma, where Gunnar Myrdal, thought about race in the United States and presented it as an American problem. But here we are 70 years later, and when he was writing, there were no black and brown people in Sweden, and now we have them here. But still, Sweden very successfully has played the game of, keeping the elephant out of the room. So we don't talk about race, even though it cuts through every political issue, whether it be class, whether it be education, health, living standards, the criminal justice, and also politics, because politics today is all about different ways of dog whistling around race. That's the only way. It's not just in France, right? And when it comes to the issue of migration, yes, race has always been central to migration. If we take the United States, for instance, it's well known, their history of selective migration, where Europeans were preferred over people from Asia or other places in the world. And if we look at Europe, I mean, we all know the horrors of the Second World War, and still they refused Jewish immigrants after that because they were perceived to be racially others because they were Jewish, the same way as Islam makes people racially others today. So having said that, I think that the change stays that the political discourse is becoming less polite. So we have a figure like Donald Trump talking about shithole countries. And even in the center right in Sweden now, they talk about, different countries that are so culturally other that their people coming from these countries cannot absorb so-called Swedish values and all of these things. And that is actually used to manage and repress and police existing populations that hail from these parts of the world. So, and also I think that this is being used to legitimize austerity politics, because white Swedish people, they become positive to austerity politics because they think that the welfare state and transfers it helps non-deserving black and brown people. So that's our problem. So what do we do about that? I think that we need to bring this to the fore. We need to talk about this even more. And I think that is actually happening all the time in Sweden. Just the other day, there was this documentary on TV about Swedish athletes, non-white athletes, who spoke about their experiences of racism throughout the Swedish sport. So those kinds of discussions, they're coming to the fore, and I think it's really important and excellent.
Thanks a lot, Kitimbwa. It's kind of it's telling that I'm thinking about current debates in my home country of Denmark as well, that the tone around race and immigration has become so harsh in the Nordic countries, whereas perhaps in the sort of in France and in the UK, there at least there's a longer history of dealing with these issues, and it has become, I guess there's also a longer history of mobilization against those racist and Afrophobic discourses, whereas it seems that the Nordic countries are still coming to terms with these problems in many ways. So I think maybe the Nordic countries have a lot to learn from the post-colonial sort of movement and thinking at this point in time, which is an an interesting sort of dilemma in a way. Thank you very much. I think we'll take a couple of final questions, and then I'll hand back to the panelists for their final reflections. So we have a comment here from Solomon Zewolde, who says, I agree with the speaker on the evasion of race in discussing migration, despite migrants and or refugees' lived experiences that are racialized, both in terms of experience and outcomes. So very much sort of echoing what we've heard from the panelists again now. I will, and there's a question in the chat as well from Dusit Abdi Ali asking, he says, thank you for this insightful webinar. What is your reflection regarding to the EU and other Western countries giving the development responsibilities to the diaspora? So what are your thoughts on the EU and other Western countries giving a development responsibility to the diaspora? That's one question. And then I'll ask Ngozi Luis Uzoma to share his question. Welcome, Ngozi. You are a PhD student from the Department of Geography at the University of Nigeria. So what is your question, please? Can you hear us, Ngozi?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Welcome.
Okay, good day. Yeah, having lived in Germany and got repatriated, I lived for 10 years, got repatriated. So I have a little bit experience of migration, but I'm an upstarter in migration research, a PhD student at the University of Nigeria. So we talk about legal pathway for migration, giving legal pathway for migration for Africans because of the problem of irregular migration. And many of them moving to Europe, they die in Mediterranean Sea, or they got into slavery in the hands of slavers in Libya. So why can't the diaspora be given the opportunity to host refugees or private sponsorship so that people can move legally from Africa to Europe instead of finding way to meander and get to Europe? That's my question and also contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So what do you think about the idea of private sponsorships, sponsorship agreements, bringing people to Europe legally instead of exposing them to the risks of crossing the Mediterranean? Thank you for that question. We have time for one more question, I think. So I'll ask Eric Ilong Ebolo. Please, do you have a question or reflection?
Thank you, Jesper. This is Eric Ilong Ebolo. I am a researcher in the Department of Political Science, Free University of Brussels. I just have a point of reflection. I know in the Western countries, what has really kept them up and moving is a very vibrant and active civil society. In this case, I'm trying to look at when you have major crises which occur within the society, there's always a very active or a very vibrant civil society which mobilizes the people. And in most cases, even if it takes several years, you have a situation where a solution is sought and it is settled. But I think this issue of migrations has become an issue whereby the Europeans themselves, they are not interested in it because of the issue of race. I see the wonderful job done by one of the panelists who is in charge of African Union Youth, something, Pan-African Institute of Peace or something, or youth, which is good. But my own argument is that I think very little is going to be done, because if you don't have a very vibrant and active civil society, which is manned by the Europeans themselves, then most of the problems, especially when it comes to race, cannot be solved. I thought with COVID, things will change, because if you look at the impact that COVID has had for the immigrants, especially with the fact that they are involved in the essential sector, I thought this could be a very good aspect which they could pick up, the government, and design a very good policy framework to see how they can address issues of migrations. But if you look at it, it is even gone worse, because even with the issue of George Floyd, we had lots of promises from companies, but I see where they put Africans is just to show that we are diverse. But when it comes to the policy issues, it is lacking. So it's just an issue of reflection. Why is it that there are civil societies? Yes, they try to speak for the migrants, but I don't think we Africans, we can actually change. It's like the DNA of the society. My thought is not very pessimistic, but I think this issue is not very much at the center, because in Belgium, a year you have at least maybe 12 or 14 national strikes, especially when it comes to pay cuts and all those kind of things. But I don't know why this issue of migration, it is not really taken seriously at the center of most civil society fights, which we see in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. So maybe not completely pessimistic, but some a reflection based in a frustration that not more is happening in terms of addressing the issues of systemic racism, I suppose. I'll hand over now. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, but I'll hand back to the panelists now for some reflections on the issues raised now in this round of questions, but also if you have some concluding thoughts. So I'll give you one last chance to share your reflections. So Bora, please, to begin, if you have any responses to the issues raised by the questions or some final thoughts, please, this is your moment to share them.
Thank you. Yes, perhaps just very quickly on the question on the EU and other Western countries. I think that was a question from was it? I don't see it anymore. There was a question whether what is our thought on the EU and other Western countries giving the responsibility of development to the diaspora.
Right.
I want to say, yeah, as much as the diaspora is very heterogeneous, I think it's important to note that many in the diaspora want to take that responsibility, because we believe the work of development can be better done by somebody who knows the continent. If we go into the individual countries, it's easier to have diaspora development work being done by somebody, let's say, from Cameroon, than by having someone who has never been to Cameroon, just read and watched documentaries about Cameroon. So that's perhaps one way to answer that. And I can attempt to answer Eric that yes, it is true. It can be frustrating to see that not much is changed. I mean, that's changed since since the 60s. I want to say it feels like we haven't had the same movement as in the US. Thank God we haven't had the same treatment as in the US. Lately, it does happen, but it's not as often as in the US. What I will say is that there are a lot of diaspora organizations striking in Brussels, even for different reasons. We have we have now people coming out and expressing their anger on how African people are being dealt with. Black and brown people being dealt with in Europe. I'll take the example of Belgium because I'm in Belgium. Every other week, you will be invited to a gathering in front of the European Parliament or the Brussels Parliament, the Belgian Parliament, sorry, to protest against the way Black and brown people are being treated, or the way countries in Africa are being unfairly dealt with. So it is true that more can be done, but again, we are living also different realities by time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bora. Tekalin, any last thoughts, either in response to the questions raised or any final issues you want to bring to the table?
Yeah, Jesper, thank you. Just quickly to reflect on my final thoughts, of course, by way I can answer some of the questions. I think generally what we have to think about when we talk a lot about racism and the issue of the experience of African diaspora in Europe and elsewhere. Of course, I want to emphasize on this issue of the complexity of the diaspora groups, and of course, racism also do not equally affect all the diaspora groups, because when it's a class issue, is very important. So when you are a professor, when you are a medical professional, and when you are a cleaner on the street, and it depends on the location, the social locations is very important. So the diaspora, some are asylum seekers, some are the citizens, some are established professionals. So it's a different ladder. So this also affects the experiences in everyday life. Related to this is also we have to think about also issue of the diaspora or all this racism issue. They are not also just victims, but also we have to also appreciate the resilience. And of course, their own interest groups, associations, help groups, self-help associations, religious communities. So the diaspora is also active, and they are also creating their own dynamics and contributing and also changing. All social changes in Europe is also a collective result of all the diaspora and also the people there. So this is a very complex picture we have to understand. They are not just victims, they are also resilient people. That's very important. And also, of course, I want to reflect also to the issue of course, the relations and the expectations and the mutual support is so that African states should contribute and also to tap. And of course, the EU used to be, or many Western countries, appreciating the remittance or the diaspora contributions. This has been also very much, it's good to appreciate that. And the World Bank, all the international organizations have been working to maximize diaspora contributions. That's good. Of course, in a way, also overemphasizing and giving the development needs as a question, the question raised as a development to diaspora groups. Of course, now it's more after the refugee crisis, things are changing. Of course, the EU externalization of border controls has been, in Mediterranean, it's becoming less effective. Now they are working more on root causes, development interventions, income generating activity creating. So Italy, UK, Sweden, all these development partners and the bilateral and the multilateral agreements now coming to the villages. So the philosophy of migration governance is also changing. It's not like the 2015's things. Now it's a different scenario and it's coming. So it's better to see the multidimensional complex picture of it. So thank you, Jesper.
Thank you very much for that reflection, Tekalin. So Kitimwa, your last reflections here. We had some questions about sort of again the engagements between Europe and Africa, but also the recurring issue of racialization and its history. Do you have any last thoughts, something we've missed or something you want to emphasize in closing here? You're still muted, Kitimba.
Issue.
There we go.
Thanks,
yeah.
Jesper. No, but I saw the last question on the Q&A from Almami Silla. The question was, in what ways diasporas can influence homeland politics? And for me, I think it gave me reason to just be very clear about what I meant when I said that. I think that we should engage from Sweden. We should engage with the Swedish states in order to influence policies towards Africa. So I'm born in Africa, I am of Africa, and I have an attachment and solidarity to the continent. But at the same time, I have lived in the country of Sweden for 40 years, right? So I think that when I said that we need to influence policies from Western capitals towards Africa, it's not in a way to dictate for Africans on the continent what needs to happen there. Rather, I think we should be contributing to creating the conditions for Africans in Africa to forge their own destinies and claim its place in the world, more or less, because that's something that have been taken away in many ways from the continents. And sometimes that means that people in Africa probably will choose paths that I wouldn't have chosen, but it's really not for me to say that this is the way forward. And sometimes I think that we in the diaspora, our behaviors remind me of the things that we rightfully have accused the Europeans of, to use the tools and resources at our disposal to exert power over Africa and Africans. So we might go there and think that, well, we know best because we've been living in Europe and we know all this stuff. So this is how things needs to be done. And we have the resources and everything to do some of those things. So sometimes that kind of worries me. Sometimes people talk about, yeah, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to go to Africa and I'm going to make a lot of money for myself. And I'm going to be somebody because I'm not somebody here and all of this stuff. And, without even thought about, Pan-Africanism or how do we raise the nation or the stuff that our leaders used to talk about back in the 50s and 60s, the names of all those people. So I just wanted to make that very clear, that we should be careful about, dictating from here, but definitely be supportive.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really important final reflection. And this actually brings our meeting to a conclusion. So I'd like to, on my behalf, thank the panelists and the audience for really a very rewarding conversation. And with that, I'll just simply hand over to my esteemed colleague and collaborator, Dr. Adeoye Akinola. Please, Oye, for a few final thoughts. Oye, the word is yours.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Dr. Jesper. And please permit me to appreciate you for attending the second of a two-part series under the theme Centering the Voices of African Migrants in African-EU Migration Debates, which engages the perspectives and experiences of African diaspora in Europe. I particularly thank the two institutes, the Nordic Africa Institute in Sweden and the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation in South Africa, that organized this very stimulating conversation. Furthermore, I appreciate the chair, my friend, Dr. Jesper, and the three speakers for their openness to critically engage the perspectives of migrants on the vast migration question in the light of the 2015 European refugee crisis. As a fact, the conversation on African migrants in Europe constitutes a practical discourse, policy and human rights issues, a sensitive political agenda, and an emotional discussion, shifting the narratives of African migration to reinforce the reality of migration is particularly important for both continents. One thought that have run through all our webinars is the point that migration should not be seen as a problem, but as an instrument of development of both continents. To our guests and partners, I set my utmost appreciation, and I hope that we can call on you for subsequent events on Africa-EU migration. Thank you, and have a good day.